Hello, my name is Karen Stiller. Welcome to the EFC webinar on how to walk with your community in times of crisis. We want to explore today the role churches can play when tragedy or disaster strikes their community. We have two expert guests with us, Merle Doherty from the Rapid Response Team of the Billy Graham Association of Canada, and Bob Larman, Director of Disaster Response Services for World Renew, which is the relief and development arm of the Christian Reformed Church. We also welcome you if you're viewing the webinar today. Thank you for joining us, and we encourage you to participate as well by sending in questions or comments using the chat function on your screen, and we will try to get to them all. So I'd like to, for us to begin by asking our guests to share very briefly about their work so everyone who's watching understands more the topic and your expertise. So Merle, could I ask you to begin, and welcome.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for saying I'm an expert. Do I have some experience, perhaps? And that experience is I'm actually 1 month shy of 4 years in this position being the manager of the chaplains in the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. And we have chaplains that respond into disasters, both man-made and natural, to provide spiritual and emotional care. Prior to my 4 years with the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, I spent 30 years as a police officer in two agencies, one the Edmonton Police Service in Edmonton, Alberta, and one the St. John City Police in St. John, New Brunswick. So perhaps a little bit of experience there has assisted me with the chaplain ministry responding into disasters.
Oh, thanks. I did not know you had been a police officer.
Oh,
yeah, that's very interesting. All right, Bob, over to you.
Well, I've been with World Renew for over 20 years, but did some of that overseas in Central America, some of it in our office, but only the last 2.5 years in disaster response services. So what we do is respond to disasters across the United States and Canada. We help people rebuild homes. We do unmet needs assessments, going door to door and gathering information that we provide to local organizations so that they can respond, and do construction estimating and other activities related to home rebuilding.
And with both of your work, you're drawing heavily on a body of Christian volunteers, right, from local churches. And what I'm thinking as I'm listening to you both describe your work, I'm thinking we do have two different, I think, parts, but complementary parts represented here. Bob with the very practical, sort of immediate, and then Merle with the spiritual, emotional support. Maybe I know I'm generalizing, and there are some overlapping areas. So I'd like to begin by just talking about how and why churches can be so well positioned to be these good responders in their communities. So Bob, why don't you lead us off with that, because you're on the ground, so to speak.
Very good. Well, churches, and depends if we're talking about church people, most of our volunteers are adults, and they've lived a life of serving God and wanting to serve others. So the motivation is strong and key for why they do it. So that's a big part of it. And they've learned about compassion, and it's a way to live out that compassion. And certainly chaplains do it as professionals, but our church volunteers, and we have thousands that go out every year, do it because that's what they've done all their life, is being compassionate, and they do it in specific situations and disasters. So they are well prepared from their training in their church life to respond when people are in particular needs.
I would agree with that, Bob, 100%. Our churches are well positioned for that reason. And I think for another reason, when I heard this question, is geographically, as you look at the churches that are around the communities, and you have the advantage of traveling across North America, as do I with this ministry, and you see the churches, and every community you go to, the churches are strategically located, and that in itself in the time of a crisis. So you have the people within who have a heart of compassion and a heart of mercy. And then you have the geographic location as well, which is a natural draw of a community. You've got your high schools and your churches. When I look at communities that are natural draws for people to come to, and I think that places churches in a good position to be responsive in any type of a disaster situation, whether it be a large one or a small one.
So you would have the actual physical structure of the church located, presumably in neighborhoods that people may not even pay much attention to when things are well. But if, say, a tornado goes through your neighborhood, or there's a shooting, God forbid, that the church is there as a physical presence that can open the doors. Is that what we're getting at?
That's what I'm saying, yes, is it is there as a physical presence. And certainly I'm in agreement with Bob that the men and women and the youth even that are in the churches, they have that compassion within them as they walk within their Christian walk.
That physical presence is important. The church can open their doors in extreme times to people that need a place to stay in a temporary shelter. They open the doors. Our volunteers often stay in churches around church property, but even earlier stages, if there's a disaster, things are destroyed, there's chaos, churches have meeting rooms. They have sanctuaries where community gatherings can happen. So their facilities can be a real resource.
An example of that, Karen, is in Toronto last year when that unfortunate incident with the van running over the pedestrians. And very close to that incident was the Willowdale Baptist Church. And that church immediately opened its doors and said, please come in for coffee, for prayer, to talk, whatever. And the doors were open with the signs on the street. And so there's an example of a church that was right there, that was able to offer assistance to those that would like to have that assistance because of where they were placed strategically.
And is there, like when I picture, say, my own church here in downtown Ottawa, I think about how long it might take us to get organized to respond quickly like that without any planning, because obviously Willowdale did not know that was going to happen, but they were able, it seems to be pretty nimble. Why is that? Is there a certain kind of church that is better able to respond quickly?
I think a church that already is doing things and has connections can respond more quickly. Especially when a disaster happens, there's not a lot of time to make relationships, get to know people, get to know what organizations are in your community, what they're doing, they get to know you. So if you have those relationships and some trust built up before something happens, you can respond a lot more quickly.
I would agree with that. If you remember way back to the thing called Y2K that happened a number of years ago. And I remember working through that process in my professional capacity. And one of the things that we saw was that ability of those churches. And secondly, that we saw that even then the Red Cross and the other agencies in the emergency field were saying, be prepared for 72 hours by yourself. In other words, if a large disaster occurs, you need to be able to be self-sufficient for up to 72 hours for the community, for the civic people to become involved and to put an infrastructure in place in a disaster. And it's interesting, I think it was just last year, I heard that teaching still being taught, the 72 hours. So as much as our churches, as Bob was saying, those that are already involved can respond quicker, people themselves have to understand they need to be prepared, but then those churches that have been doing the day-to-days, they can get their doors open very quickly. As they did in Toronto, we were extremely surprised. Our chaplains were on the ground the very next morning, and the church already had their doors open that next morning.
Yeah, that is impressive. So if you are a member of a church in a Canadian city and you haven't dealt with this sort of thing before, but you do want to have some level of readiness, what are some things you can do, this week to be ready in case something bad happens next week?
That's a really good question. And I would say if you're not already engaged in a capacity within your community, is begin the conversation to become engaged. Bob spoke it so eloquently, is those churches that are already engaged in the community in whatever capacity are the churches that can respond the quickest when something happens. So if a church is engaged, if they're not engaged at this time to a degree, is to get engaged, have the conversations within their infrastructure of leadership in a church and say, how can we get engaged? And it doesn't mean they have to do everything, because each church can do what each church can do, and it'll be unique in that church. But what is it? And have those conversations, and then to begin to have conversations external to perhaps the emergency operations of their community, perhaps to the civic leadership, perhaps just to the body of the church. Okay, if something happens, here's what we're going to do. And we're going to begin that by starting here with our conversation, moving into training on a daily basis, and so forth.
How do you get over the idea that, well, nothing bad like that could happen here, for example, or that kind of feeling that people might think you're being paranoid, or, you know, you're going to be like the guy who's got the bunker in his backyard? How do you get over that, I don't know, overly idealistic idea that people have?
That is a difficult one, and I don't think you can completely get over it. If it hasn't happened in your community and you don't see a reason, it really is hard for people to be prepared and stay prepared. But I think just it does take reminders that you so often hear when something tragic happens, unexpected, people say, we never thought it could happen to us. We never thought it would happen here. So thus, repeating that to people in our churches, in our community, that's what every community says, or most communities say ahead of time. So I think that's a starting point, that it can happen where you are. And because of that, you can't, because people are reluctant, you may not be able to get them to go to week-long trainings or extensive training, but to get the basics in place so they know the first steps, as Merle was saying, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm. That is so true. I think I've heard that in every community we've been in the last 4 years that I've been a part of this ministry, and that is, I didn't think it would happen here. And unfortunately, it does. And if you look at what's happening in Canada, in the USA, there's so many things: a tanker upsetting, a train going off the rails, a natural disaster, whatever that may be. They are happening, and they are happening in our communities. And so part of the preparation is training, and training on a day-to-day basis. Bob was saying you don't have to be the expert with years and years of training to do something. It's that one-day training sessions, those 2-day training sessions over time, the implementation of that on a daily basis. So in a crisis situation, in these disasters, trauma and grief sets in. Well, we can deal with, or we do deal with, trauma and grief every day in the churches. I look around this amazing building I work in with the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and there are people going through crisis and trauma in this building. And so in a church, there are people going through crisis on a daily basis. So if we as a church step up and we look after our own congregation on a daily basis, and we put the basic training, I'm not saying be a counselor or a psychiatrist or a mental health advocate, but to come alongside of our congregants, to sit with them and to be able to walk with them through those daily griefs, whatever they may be, those daily traumas. Something as simple as a motor vehicle collision to someone could be a major trauma. Walk with them. And as we walk daily with people as a congregation, as we train our congregation, this is how we can walk daily with them. Then when those larger one comes, we have been training our congregations daily for the bigger ones when they come.
Yeah, that's actually super encouraging to think that we're already, we're being trained as we walk as Christians. Bob?
Perhaps to add a different component, I think the assumption in what we're saying now is training for early response and being ready and being able to respond. But what people often forget about is the results of disasters can take months and even years to work through. So even if a church isn't ready to do as much as they would like in the first stages, they can get ready and get involved later on. We worked with a church in Williams Lake, BC, who months after the fires went through trauma healing training for some of their leaders, and they gathered other churches together and were then better able to do what they did naturally in trauma care for people after the fires. So and it didn't kick into gear till almost a year afterward, and the people were still suffering and working through that. So they were able to do that, and trauma care, and for people who had lost jobs or homes through the fires, but also the same skills applied to the trauma of divorce or the trauma of losing a family member. So there are applicable skills for the whole church. A week and a half ago, I was with a group of volunteers. We finished up after 3 years in a community rebuilding homes, and we had a celebration in the church, a worship service, and then a meal together afterwards with the volunteers and the church members and the local organizations. So it's important to be ready in the beginning and do what you can, but then at the same time, it's very important to recognize that after the TV cameras are gone and after the obvious emergency is gone, people are still suffering the effects in more hidden ways often too. So I would encourage people to be alert to those and look for ways for an ongoing response.
I would echo that, Bob. This weekend, I will be in a small community that a very tragic incident occurred 3 years ago. And they have called us asking if we would come down and speak with them on trauma and grief. And it's been 3 years. And so there is that aftercare aspect as well. And most certainly, we were there in those days, 3 years ago, those early days, and we're going back. And so there is ongoing care as well. A lot of the ongoing care can be done by those mental health practitioners, counselors that are in the community because they are there day in, day out, they live there. But when churches reach out to the Billy Graham organization or other organizations, and if we have a training that we can come in and offer so that people can walk through their trauma and grief, even 3 years later, we're more than willing to do that because we recognize that it's not the 3-day event while the cameras are there, everything's over, everything's fine, on we go with our life. It is ongoing.
Well, we have such a higher awareness now of PTSD, which, helps us understand that as well. So we do have a question in from someone. How does the church get trained? So Merle, you mentioned the training that the Billy Graham Association offers. Can you tell us more about that specifically?
Certainly. BillyGraham.ca is our website, BillyGraham.ca. And on that website, you will see trainings all across Canada. And those trainings are in place for 2019. And a couple of trainings we're negotiating to go into the communities. But the training that we put on is called Sharing Hope in Crisis. It's a 1-day course. And really, I look at it as Trauma and Grief 101. We walk people through what trauma is. We walk people through what grief is. We walk people through how you can minister with people through trauma and grief. And we do it from the perspective of the congregants. We do it from the perspective of the soccer games, the hockey games, the community that you're active in, that you can take these skills with you. We don't train people to be social workers. We train people to be compassionate and to walk and to have that skills. It's interesting, last weekend we held one in Toronto, and I had an email afterwards on the same day from a participant, and they said what I've heard many times from our chorus is, I can't believe how simple this was and how good it was. I already see myself using this next week in the ministry I'm involved in. And I've heard that so many times because we're equipping a little bit and we're equipping a little bit, and people feel motivated and they're willing to step out and do something on those day-to-days when they have that equipping. And so that's some of the training we have. And then we go beyond that with critical incident stress management training, which is more in-depth training. But those are all on our website, and we offer those into communities.
Okay, thank you. Bob, how about for the practical response? Should churches be sending teams to, be trained in things like first aid in case, I know you're sending teams out into communities, but in case a disaster struck their own community, is that kind of training, does that make sense?
First aid training is always good for churches or businesses or anywhere that you are, certainly. So I like that idea. So then you have people ready. Our particular work doesn't focus so much on that. We'd rather have people with home rebuilding skills for the most part, for the big part of our jobs. And even we take a lot of volunteers who don't have those skills. We need a couple leaders who have the skills and they can organize and train a little others. And we put a lot of volunteers to work without those skills. So really it takes leadership with the skills and a willingness to work with people who want to learn and those people who want to learn to get the job done.
And both of your organizations and the work you do are reminders that we actually don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Like a church can, tap into already existing structures and have people come alongside, right? Which is excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Merle.
I think that's the beauty of each church. Each church is unique in the church that it is, and it will be able to offer into the community what it can. The next church down the road, down the street in the next community will have a different set of infrastructure that can assist. And so it's not about as a church doing everything, because it's not possible to do everything. But what is it can they do with the infrastructure they have? Bob mentioned that when we respond into the disaster situations like we're sleeping in the churches. So I'm in an office that's maybe 12 by 12 here. In a church, this office could be a couple's room, sleeping on the floor or on their mattress. And so if that's what a church can offer, then that's wonderful. If there's a church that has showers and commercial kitchens, then they can offer other things to the community. Most certainly, getting in touch with their local emergency management to see if what they have can be utilized in the time of crisis, because there are criteria that they like to achieve. But having that conversation, here's my church, this is what we have, can we fit into your emergency plan?
Yeah. Bob, when you take your teams in to areas that have been hit and you're bringing in a team of volunteers to rebuild and do, the appropriate jobs for your team, how are you generally received? Are people suspicious of you as a church group, as a group of Christians, or are they just happy to have help?
Both certainly happen. People are happy to have help, but even when they receive volunteers, there's suspicion. And it's a lot more common than I would have suspected before I started in this role. And often it's because people have been taken advantage of already. People who call themselves contractors show up and take their money and do half the job, if they do any job at all. They've had different groups promise to do help in different ways, and for whatever reason didn't follow through. So they have good reason to be suspicious. We're another group saying we're going to do this or that, and they need help, so they often welcome the groups, but don't always have full confidence that will happen. But it's amazing how that changes when you do what you say you're going to do. You show up the day you say you're going to show up, and you show up the next day, you show up the next day, and the attitude changes, and that's just a wonderful transformation of the homeowner we're serving. Often volunteers are disappointed in the beginning because they're working on a home and the homeowner isn't around, or maybe is around but doesn't participate. But when you go back the next day and the next day and the third day, they ask, is there something I can do to help? The fourth day, they get their other family member from across town to help, and working together when they see what you're doing. So there is distrust, but the best way to work through that is to show up and do what you say you're going to do. Do it every day.
I love that. How about you, Merle? You are literally, you and your team are walking up alongside people who may be grieving or shocked or whatever. I can't imagine you're not met with some level of suspicion.
At times, for sure, both at a civic level and at a personal level. What our chaplains find is when we respond into a disaster situation, we're always responding with our big brother, Samaritan's Purse. Samaritan's Purse do the humanitarian work. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, our chaplains, we do the spiritual and emotional care. And so people do lift an eyebrow wondering, why are you here? And that's why our chaplains are well trained in critical incident stress management, is that they can talk to people. And after Bob was saying, they learn how to trust them in the build, in the rebuild. And it's the same with the spiritual and emotional care. People start to learn to trust us. They may be a little bit standoffish at first, but when they recognize that our chaplains truly do care, that they truly are listening and they truly are interested in what's going on in their lives at that time, they slowly get won over to, okay, this person cares, and we do care. And we walk with them for that short time that we're with them, and they learn to trust us. We don't violate that trust at any time. We're always so careful when someone shares something with us that is traumatic. It's such a privilege for us to hear that we cherish that and hold that close, and we walk with those people. So the trust does come, absolutely does come. And even on the civic level, 2 to 3 days, very consistently, I find that our chaplains on about the third day, they are welcomed, and they're welcomed because they recognize the training our chaplains have, and that we are in the community to hear the hearts of those that have broken hearts. And they recognize that that's what we do very well. Are we a Christian faith-based organization? Absolutely we are. And if the conversation goes there, then we go there as well. But we want to hear people's hearts, and that trust that develops, it opens people up to speaking even more with us.
I'd like to ask you about listening then, that you talked about hearing people's hearts. And I will say that we have an EFC podcast, and I interviewed Merle on that podcast, and we talked a lot about the power of listening. And that means you're not necessarily sharing all the answers. And I think sometimes that may be difficult for some of us, especially if we are followers of Jesus and we believe truly that he is the answer, that it's hard not to say that. So I'd love for you both to share a little bit about, the power of being the ministry of presence and just being a good listener. So Bob, do you want to start with that? I'm sure you do a lot of that in the field.
Our volunteers do a lot of listening, and even those volunteers who their primary job is to rebuild a home, they're always instructed, if the homeowner's there and want to talk, or family members, put down your hammer, put down your saw. That's the time to sit and listen. And it starts with listening. People have been through a traumatic event, and not only the disaster, the flood, or the hurricane, but the trauma of the months of trying to get their home restored and the problems with it. So they listen. Where a chance for them to share often happens is people ask them why they're there, and a little bit astounded at times that people would leave their homes and their family and their hometown and go across the country to serve them. And then they ask, how much are you getting paid? They say, well, not getting paid. And then they're further astounded. But then the question comes up, why are you doing this? So people can share from their own heart and their own faith and their own life why they're doing it, the love of God that they feel they want to share with others. So they're not necessarily feeling a need to give the answer to the person, but by sharing the answer they have for themselves, in a sense, they're giving the answer to them in that way. So that's a way that our volunteers frequently find they can share their faith in a way that's appropriate in the context.
Mm-hmm. I can't, I have to say that's such an amazing answer, because it's my answer too. And people, when you're speaking with them and when you're walking with them, you're right, Bob, as we hear about what's going on right then and there and how the process around that is. But as chaplains, we also hear about last month and last year and the year before. And so we listen to them. And you hear us saying, listen, Karen, you hear us saying that a lot. We listen a lot. We listen a lot. And we don't talk a lot. There's this expression called a ministry of presence. Well, Bob's people, their ministry of presence has a saw and a hammer in their hand, and they're putting up walls and they're putting down floors and roofs. And my chaplains, they have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and they're standing next to someone and they're just listening. And the ministry of presence, it comes through because of Christ within us. They speak, we listen, and we just stand there. Sometimes we don't even have to speak for a long time. We just need to listen and listen, empathize, sympathize. I've cried at situations when I've been out there. I've cried with people, and I've cried in trainings because of the stories you hear. And people just, they open up to that. For me to have the answers, oh my, I don't have the answers. I think I've said this to you before, Karen, and I'll say it again because it's so true, is people will ask me something, or they'll say, Merle, will you pray with me? And the first thing I do is go, help, Lord, because I don't have the answers. And I don't. And if I don't have the answer, I'll let them know I don't have that answer. Sharing from my personal perspective is absolutely a wonderful way to open up people to listening about my story and the gospel. And speaking the gospel into their lives from my perspective, or from a perspective of responding to multiple disasters.
Well, it feels like I would have to do a lot of relearning about how to be with people. So if somebody wanted to actually have a career or a long-term daily ministry and disaster response, both spiritual and the humanitarian response, this is a question from a viewer, how would they get started on that? Do you guys have any recommendations? Bob, do you want to go first?
A good way to start is if they have an opportunity to volunteer and volunteer in a couple different areas. You know, we do the home rebuilding, the chaplains. There's different people that even just do warehousing and moving the materials around that people need. So if you have a chance to volunteer and get a little experience that way, and perhaps a couple different type of organizations, different types of responses would be good. So that's often a good starting point.
Certainly volunteering is, when we go into a community, wherever it is in Canada, we don't bring 200 volunteers with us or 300 volunteers. The volunteers are from the community. So if something occurs in your community and you hear that we are in the community, the Samaritan's Purse team, then respond to that and start by responding to, I would like to volunteer for the day. For chaplains, for the Billy Graham Evangelistic Chaplains, our chaplains, because of the training, because of the security checks that we have in our chaplains, there's more involved before we will send out a chaplain. We won't send a chaplain out that volunteers for the day. We don't have day chaplains. Very rarely, I shouldn't say we don't, it's very rare. If we know someone in the community and they're a pastor, they're involved in a mental health or something, they can come out and for a day we will allow them because we know that they have the skill set. But for the Billy Graham chaplains, it's a matter of applying online for us, contacting us here in the Calgary office. We walk with them through a process, through an interview process, through an application process, and then we begin with training. Our chaplains, they have to have 49 hours of training, and that training is all critical incident stress management and trauma and grief training. And they can go out. They never go out alone. Our chaplains are always paired with someone, and there's always a supervisor in the field that's their role, is to supervise and ensure the chaplains are doing their roles. So certainly applying to volunteer, if we're in the community, is the best way to start. And for chaplains is calling us here or emailing us here in Calgary and asking if we would consider them as chaplains, and we would walk them through that process.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to loop back a little bit to the very practical end of things. And I was thinking about the sending of stuff, because that is sometimes what churches do. You know, that's their immediate response is, everybody bring in your used clothing, or let's send all this stuff. And Bob, can you tell us, is that a good thing to do?
Seldom. It's best really the only time it's good is if there are specific requests that people need this item and they need this quantity, and you can get it to them soon, because if you get it to them 2 months later, which often happens, that need may not exist anymore. But when sending things originates from the desire of the sender and not the need of the recipient, it's often creates more problems. I've been in too many disaster sites where parking lots are just full of piles of clothes and other things that weren't needed at that time or didn't have a distribution. So there are times when it does make sense to collect goods and send them. But again, based on a request of a legitimate organization or local people and saying what they need, and if you can get them what they need in a timely way, that's great. Most other times, not so much.
Certainly waiting to the request comes, whether it's a request for finances from one of the NGOs that is in place in a community, or a request from a disaster service agency. Wait for the request. I have also seen the piles and piles and stacks and tractor trailers of products and materials. Wait and see what that need is. You can partner with your own church. So if you're an Alliance church, let's say, call the Alliance church and you say, what are your greatest needs right now? And let's not forget, what are your great needs in the future? That need is not in the next 3 and 4 days. I'm sorry, the need is in the next 3 and 4 days, but it's also in the next 3 months and the next 6 months. And so you can partner 2 ways. You can partner in a large way with organizations such as ours, and you can partner with your local denominations, or perhaps you have a group in that community that you're aware of. What are their needs? Chances are there's an impact within that organization that is direct or indirect, and they will know what is the need. I was in one community where I seen that work so well, where the church and the community had a district of churches come to that church and say, what are your needs? We're going to walk with you through this. And that's exactly what they did. Is the leadership of that church was able to say, these are our needs. And those needs changed as the disaster grew, as the response grew, and as a time. So the change in the needs, the church was able to meet that. The denomination was able to meet that church's needs. Now, that's just one church. They're looking after those people impacted. But that's some of the ways people can. Wait for the ask, as Bob says. Too many trailer loads of stuff sit for a long time that then they have to sort out, what do we do with this material, this product?
Yeah, I love the idea of, if I'm a Anglican church in Ottawa, contacting the Anglican church in the city that's been hit with a tragedy or disaster. Like, that feels like a really good idea to me. It's good. If the other thing I wondered was about preparing for the eventuality of a disaster. Could a church be doing things like buying a generator and stocking a storeroom in the basement full of, dry goods and water or whatever? Is that a good thing to do? Or, Bob, would that be helpful for a church to be ready in that way?
I expect so. I don't know of churches that are doing that, and I guess we haven't actually aren't actively promoting that for churches. Again, with the difficulty of having, you can do it and buy those things, but then generator has to be run a few times, keep it running. If you have provisions, they have to be rotated.
Got it.
Just the logistics of doing that for a church and maintaining that.
Right.
It would be good if someone could do it. We don't push that, I think, just for the difficulty of the ongoing maintenance of that and keeping it up to date, so it would be useful.
Well, maybe it would actually offer a sort of a false sense of readiness for that reason. And maybe it comes back again to the idea of linking in with people who know what they're doing.
Right. It depends on the disaster, what the needs are. So you could have provisions set up that may not make any difference for whatever the emergency is you're dealing with. So it's a little harder that way.
Yeah. Merle?
One of the things I've seen, Karen, in just about every community we've been in is the large corporations, the food stores, and they respond so amazingly. Perhaps the entire community has been devastated and the local food in that community is not palatable. Well, outside of that community, food will come in. The response of agencies and people is amazing. A church to stockpile 30 pallets of water, well, now you get into a rotation problem. And so again, I think it goes back to is have the conversation as a church body, as a church leadership. What can we offer? And they may not know what they can offer. They may look at their church and go, well, we don't have anything. Well, if I go into a church and I see a children's room and I see a storeroom and I see the chapel, I go, wow, I can sleep 20 there and I can sleep 5 there and I can sleep 3. So they may not know what they have. And so have those conversations with their local emergency operations people and say, we'd like to help in some way. How can that be? Maybe that organization will say, well, could you stock this? And if they do that, they'll also have a plan in place of a rotation of that.
Okay.
And so begin with that linkage. Who can, what do we have? Maybe we don't know. Go out and ask those that are in the business. Every community has someone in the business of emergency management, and move from there.
And I'm wondering also about the power of churches working together. I know that that came up with Willowdale in Toronto. And I should mention that our January, February cover story for Faith Today magazine is on this very topic. And I happened to be the writer for that story, and Willowdale mentioned that because they had already been working with other churches, they were able to tap into that network. But even if you didn't have that in your DNA, to reach out to other congregations to find out, how you could work together would seem to me to be a good thing to do. How about that, Merle?
I would agree. I'm going to put a plug in here for a community that we're currently working with, and that's Ottawa. And we were in Ottawa last fall, and unfortunately we were there the year before for the flood as well. And what's happening in Ottawa is the pastors and the community are pulling together a task force to respond. What are the resources we have cumulatively? So these pastors, this is in the initial stages, are working hard on this. And how can we come together as churches, a faith community, and what do we have to offer? And so that's in place right now, and that can be duplicated in other communities as well. How, as a faith community, can we come together? This is who we have, this is what we have, and now how do we utilize what we do have to be able to be of service out into the community? It's definitely very important to have that ongoing conversations at the multi-faith level, at the church level, multiple churches, for sure. Without that, you're isolated. You're a church by yourself, and you're not sure what the church down the street has. But by doing that, you can be stronger because you each have different resources.
Yeah, good.
I think it makes our response stronger, but it also makes our witness stronger when churches work together. When people see churches separate and not willing to work together, that doesn't provide the kind of witness we want. So we do a better physical response and a better witness by working together.
Excellent. As we wind up, Bob and Merle, I'd like to invite you to just share really briefly a very moving moment you've had lately on the field that you're able to share, or a positive story of a church who did something really wonderful that had an impact, very brief, and then just your encouragement to churches to get involved. But first, we have a last question. What to do when the local emergency services person is really on board with the church, but the fire chief has no interest in community support? So I guess that's pretty specific, but generally speaking, if the community then is not responding to your offers to help in the way that you might hope, how would you proceed, do you suppose? Bob, do you want to tackle that first?
I would work with the willing. So and focus on those that want to work with you and are willing, and go as far as you can that way. Not everyone will, and you can't do. And again, since you can't do it all, you probably get enough work for your church and enough places to be involved with those who are willing to work with you. So work with the willing and focus on those.
Okay, that's good. All right, Merle, do you want to go first in winding us up then?
I think as we've gone through the process over the last number of years of working with churches and communities, I thought about what is a church, because there's a number of them, what is a church doing? And all churches have an after disaster response. They have a change because it's the new church. The people that have been impacted, it's their new life. And the church has its new life. But one that comes to mind is in Fort McMurray, Alberta, there's a church, it's called Fort City Church. And in 2016, there was a devastating fires there. And the impact after, so the fire was extremely impactful. The entire community, 82,000 people were evacuated. But the impact to this one church was that 1/3 of the people never came back. So a church lost 1/3 of its congregants. And that's because those people never moved back into the community. But what the church did is they saw that there was a gap afterwards. And that gap was in the youth, that the youth had nothing. Not that they had nothing, but they didn't have the resources available. And so they started a program called Third Space. And so Third Space was a place to come and be safe. They had their space at home, they had their space at school, and this was a third space. And this third space was a place where the youth could come, and still do, twice a week and have a meal, and they would just get loved on by staff in the church. What has the impact been? They have seen youth come to the church. Their goal in 2018 was 30. They're at 150 students coming to their church. And what has the impact been? Is they have youth coming to the church that would never go to a church normally. Those youth are impacting their families, and the families are coming to the church that normally wouldn't. The civic leadership has seen that this church has stepped and filled the gap, and one of the gaps that the community had by offering this service to the church and the youth. And so they've expanded the signature, they've expanded the impact of that church, and most importantly, they've shown the community that the love of the church is for the community. And that's huge. The pastor there has said that the love that they're able to pour around is being received so well. And because of that, the church that lost 1/3 of its congregants has those back. I'm sorry, lost 2/3 of the congregants, and they have them back now.
That's beautiful. The church doing what the church does best, right?
Yeah.
Bob?
There are motivating and exciting stories about churches and volunteers, but I think what often impacts me the most is the disaster survivors and their stories. So just a week and a half ago, I was in a home with a senior woman and with the volunteers, and we had completed that home. And she showed us this wall that the volunteers had fixed and this ceiling, part of the ceiling. And then I got a good idea what we did, but she had made sure we went through every room of the house and showed what was new and what she had and what she didn't have, and her excitement about that and her joy to be able to live in her home and be in her home again. The joy on her face and the excitement and the gratitude from that woman, that's why we do what we do.
Yeah.
And the phrase that you hear so often is, you didn't just rebuild my home, you restored my life.
Beautiful. Yeah. I think you guys have great jobs, if I may say so.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Merle and Bob, for joining us today. And thank you for everybody who watched the webinar. We do them monthly, so you can find out about our upcoming webinars at the efc.ca. You can also tap into our podcasts on that site as well, which we mentioned. If you have not seen the January-February cover story of Faith Today that features the same topic, you can actually email us and we'd be happy to send you a copy for free. So you can email us from the website, or you can email me directly at senioreditor@faithtoday.ca. So thank you again. And we hope to connect with you again in the future.
Thank you so much.